Hello and welcome. My mum is quite small, but when my brother and I were children, she had a way of walking into a room and just standing there and looking at us and saying nothing. And we would start to confess all the things that we had been doing wrong or naughtily in the period of time that she had not been with us. That silence just made us confess all kinds of things that we shouldn't really have been confessing. And I'm sure if you didn't have a parent like that, I can guarantee you would have had a teacher at school who did the same thing, who could walk into a room, hold the room in silence, look at you, maybe even tip their glasses down and look over the top of their glasses. And you will be like, oh my goodness, we're for the high jump. And I love it, absolutely love it in a TV drama, a good courtroom drama, when the lawyer asks a really pointed question to the defendant and they answer, and then the lawyer just stands there in silence and then just says, I see. I love that delayed I see, because it doesn't mean anything. And then you're like, do they believe me? Do they not believe me? Essentially, silence is an incredible tool that is really, really underused in communication at work. So today we are going to dive into why we need silence, why it's a really good tool to be using, how we can use it, when we can use it, and where we can use it. And we're going to look at that in the framework of 6 different conversations. So let's dive into why silence is a really, really useful communication tool. So silence is essentially part of a power dynamic. Now, I feel a little bit uncomfortable using the word power dynamic. Power for some people can mean that we are commanding or demanding things of other people, that we are essentially using our power in ways that are not very influential, but are more about ordering people around. So I like to use the idea of status. So whenever we're communicating in a group, regardless of what our title is, regardless of how senior or how junior we are, we always want to be trying to equalize the status. Until such a moment, we might need to use our status very slightly to create something to happen in that room. So I always try to think about it in terms of status. Now, generally, the person who has the highest status in the room, and that may or may not be to do with their title, they're usually doing one of 2 things. One, they're either asking questions, so they're getting information from the people in the room to try and understand the situation more effectively. Or 2, they're silent. So they're silently watching and listening, absorbing information, assimilating what's going on, and working out where the next best question might be, or the next best action might be, or just looking at the dynamic of the room and seeing where actually the actual bottleneck is, or the actual problem is, rather than what seems to be being discussed, which might be a symptom or it might be the cause. So generally the person who has the highest status in the room is either asking questions or is quiet, is silent. So silence can be a really powerful tool to demonstrate that we are the person that has the highest status in that room. Now, as women, we do tend to find this a little bit challenging. We like to work collaboratively on the whole. That's not true of all women, but on the whole, women would prefer to work in a collaborative style. And so there's 2 things that happen here. We find silence difficult for unconscious reasons and conscious reasons. So women are very, very good at seeing people. So we can walk into a room and we can tell who's happy and who's sad and who's frustrated. And we remember that somebody's child has been unwell and we remember to ask them about it. So there's lots of things that go on in a room that we see. They don't need to be spoken. They can be unspoken, but we see those. We're very, very good at seeing. What we're not so good at is being seen. So when that lens turns around and it's focused on us. And we don't enjoy that, whether things have gone not so well or they've gone really, really well. So say we're having a really bad day and somebody comes over and says, are you okay? Are you okay? In genuine concern, our tendency is to go, oh, I'm fine. Thank you. I'm fine. I'm just having a bit of a funny moment. And we brush it off and we try to get ourselves back to our sort of normal equilibrium as far as that other person is concerned. And equally, if we've done brilliantly well at something and someone says, that was incredible, you were amazing, we tend to brush it off. We go, oh, it was nothing, and I had an amazing team, and we dismiss it. We don't enjoy being seen. We find it very discomforting to be seen in discomfort and to be seen when things are going really, really well. Now, if we think about silence, we have all that attention and nothing is happening. So we are the only thing that can be seen in that moment. Now that can feel very, very discomforting. Now the other reason that we find silence a little bit difficult comes down to what we think of ourselves. It comes down to whether we trust ourselves, where we have self-trust, i.e. we can cope when things don't work and we can cope when things go really, really well. But it also comes down to a sense of, are we enough? And most women that I have worked with through my career have feelings of not enoughness. And so we want to over-justify. We over-justify by perfecting our presentations. We over-justify by over-justifying our ideas. And we over-justify by speaking, by continuing to talk. So we're trying to establish that we have a right to speak, that we have a right to be at this table, that we have a right to have this idea or this thought or this concern by talking and talking and talking. And so our audience never really gets a chance to fully absorb or assimilate the ideas and see how they feel about it because we're over-justifying. So silence can feel really, really stretchy. Really stretchy, because if we don't have a mindset of self-trust and we don't have a mindset of feeling like we're enough, that moment of everybody looking at us can feel really, really discomforting. So today we're going to look at 6 different situations at work where you might need to employ silence, or if you did employ silence, you might increase your impact. You might increase how people feel about you in terms of your credibility. They might look to you and think, oh, wow, they know a lot more than I thought they did. So silence can be used to really increase your credibility, increase your impact in terms of the amount of information that somebody else is absorbing, or the amount they feel that they are being held in the moment. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Now, one of the most obvious things, because this is one of the things that I see all the time, one of the most obvious spaces where we can use a greater degree of silence is before we speak and after we speak. Now, I know that sounds really crazy, and I'm sure you're expecting me to say pausing, but actually that moment before we open our mouths, before we share our ideas, is a really critical moment. It's that moment of gaining everybody's attention. So there are some people who are brilliant at doing this. They stand or they sit to speak and they don't dive straight in, because that's our tendency, isn't it? It's like, okay, Emma, could you please update us on X? And I just start talking straight away. Actually, there's a beautiful opportunity, rather than diving straight in, there's a beautiful opportunity to create a pause before we begin to speak. Because if we do that, we are holding the space. We are equalizing the status between us and the other speakers in the room, and maybe just elevating our status just very slightly to say, okay, I'm going to speak, and it'd be wonderful if you all listened. Because in that moment of silence, we're so unused to silence, what happens is that everybody will turn to look at you. And when everybody is looking at you, as stretchy as that might feel, then you know you have their attention. You've done nothing except hold the space in order that they're looking at you. And now you can begin to speak, knowing that you've got their attention. Because otherwise our tendency would be like, okay, if I could just, can everybody? And so we get this sort of slightly clunky, awkward start. But by just holding the space, waiting for everybody's attention on you, then you can begin. You know that you've got their attention. It's a really, really fantastic way of gaining people's attention without, lording it over people or dinging a glass or any of those kinds of things that you don't need. You don't need to do any of those things. Silence is enough to gather their attention. And then at the end of speaking, there's a real temptation to kind of think, oh, I'm done, great, sit down. But actually, if you think about it in terms of what might happen with a comedian on stage or actors or a singer, they don't finish singing or they don't finish making you laugh or they don't finish doing the play and then just immediately leave the stage. There's a moment at the end of their performance where they just stand still. They just stand still and they look at their audience and their audience looks back and their audience shows their appreciation, hopefully by clapping. But there's that moment of connection between the audience and the performer. And just in the same way, when we have spoken, we need that little bit of silence at the end to indicate to the rest of the group that you've finished talking and that's the end. But also so that they can just see you in that moment and you can see them in that moment. So just taking that pause before we sit down. Now, if you do that, you will increase your credibility. You will increase your perceived excellence from your and your perceived expertise from your listeners. But I know that it can feel really, really stretchy to do that. Now, in order to be able to do that, we really need to work on mindset. So if you want to do this, if you want to create that moment of silence before you speak and after you speak, I really want you to think about why you? Why are you telling them this? What experience do you have? What expertise do you have that will help your listeners do their jobs better or understand a situation more effectively or be better at living, a life hack? Why are you telling them this thing? So where does your expertise lie? Why should you be talking about this particular topic? I want you to think about why now. Why do they need to know this today, now, in this moment? How is it going to help them be better, do better, be better at their jobs? So think about why now. And then really think about how is this going to help them, like very specifically. What will they be able to think or feel or do after you've finished speaking that will impact their lives or impact their jobs or impact their end users? So how is it going to help? Specifically, really specifically how it's going to help. So if you think about why you, why now, and what are you doing that's going to really genuinely help them do better or be better or make better decisions, if you can think about those things, then it really elevates your sense of like, oh, actually, I have a lot to offer in this situation. I have a lot to give. And that can really help us hold that moment when everybody is looking at us and that moment when we are looking at them when we finished. So having that ability to hold the space before and after you've spoken really elevates your perceived expertise and gets people's attention without you having to do anything dramatic. Now, the second area, and you're not going to be particularly surprised about this, the second area where I feel silence could be used more effectively is the space between ideas. So we know our topic, we know our subject, we know what we're talking about. But sometimes for our audience, this is going to be the first time they've even heard this information or heard this idea. And we need to allow them time to absorb the information, to assimilate the information and to relate it to what they already know, and also to work out how they feel about this information. Now, if we're just continually talking and there's no space between the ideas, then that makes it really, really difficult for your audience. And I want you to think about the space between the ideas, the space between your topics or your thoughts is actually, that's where the space where your ideas can grow. Yeah, they're going to grow for you, but they're also going to grow for your audience because they're absorbing them into their schemas, their understanding of the world or their understanding of their job and working out how that might help or that might hinder. And it's where ideas grow. That space is additive. That's where somebody else might be able to interject and go, oh, yeah, and we could do this, or oh, and what if we built on top of that and we did X? It's a space where ideas can grow. It's additive. It's generative. So those spaces, those silences, where you're just allowing people to think and absorb, is essential for your idea taking root in them, but also for your idea taking root and growing into something even better, because it's possible that it could become even better. So in terms of how you can help yourself mindset-wise here, is thinking about, how would you like that space? Do you want that space to be somewhere where your ideas can grow, where they can get even better, where you're initiating conversation rather than download? Because, as I said, most of us like to work collaboratively. We want ideas from other people. So if we can feel like we can have those spaces where people can add in and grow our ideas, then that can feel really, really positive. So those spaces are not silence where people are simply looking at you. They're spaces to allow something else, something better to occur. So just doing some journaling around that concept, about this idea of having a space to grow your idea in between your thoughts, is really, really helpful. Now, if you would rather something more practical, I would recommend you do the mindset work, but we also want some practical tips. Is when you've delivered an idea, if you deliver your idea, you've finished off your content about that particular thing, breathe. It's one of the things I see people not doing. They get through an idea and then they're like, take a little sip of air, literally like a little sip, and then they carry on with the next idea. But actually, when you've delivered that idea, that's a wonderful space to breathe, to recenter yourself, reground, take a nice deep breath, and in your head, simply count to 3. That's as easy as that. 1, 2, 3. Now I can deliver my next idea. Yeah. So take that breath, count to 3 in your head, and then move on. It's a really simple, practical thing that you can do that will just allow that space to occur. Now, if you're first trying this, you might not feel like you can entertain conversation and you want people to chip things in, and that's fine. You can just tell them, it's like, brilliant, can we make that a discussion at the end? Or I'll speak to you afterwards, or however you want to manage it. You get to manage it in the way that you want. If you're feeling super comfortable, then allow those ideas to grow and then move on to your next idea. If you're presenting and you have a script, or you have your slide pages printed out in front of you, you know where you're going from place to place, you can actually just mark your script. So if you want a significant pause, I do 2 double slashes. So we know that that means that's a significant pause. If you need a little pause, it's just 1 slash. But just by putting that diagonal in there, it just tells the brain, oh yeah, this is the moment where I'm just going to take a little bit of a pause and allow those ideas to grow. So place number 3, that we can use silence a bit more effectively, is actually after questions. So when we've been asked a question, we have a tendency to want to jump in and answer that question straight away. Now, sometimes that's great, because sometimes that's been driven by excitement and enthusiasm, and you're getting to talk about the thing that you love talking about. So sometimes we want to answer that question straight away because we just know the answer, and we know it's a really good, juicy answer as well. But sometimes answering it immediately doesn't necessarily give the audience or give the individual who's asked the question or yourself the best quality. So what I mean by that is by acknowledging the person that has spoken. So, oh, thank you so much. That's a great question. Even that simple response, it just gives your brain a little bit more time to formulate, what's the best way I can answer this question for this audience? Now, it might be a question that you get asked all the time and you know what you're going to say. But actually, is that the right way to frame it for this audience? So by just taking that moment, breathing and acknowledging the other person before you continue can be really, really helpful. So you're having like a mini silence as you acknowledge the question and you're like, thank you, that's a great question. And then you've had time to breathe and formulate your answer. But just taking that moment of silence while you're considering the question, The asker is going to appreciate it because it's going to feel like you're really thinking about the answer. And it also gives you time to formulate what you're going to say so that it fits this particular scenario, this particular audience in the best way possible. So acknowledge, breathe, formulate your answer. So breathing and formulating is your silence bit. And then you can answer in the most effective way possible. Now, I'm not saying don't answer questions with enthusiasm straight away, because that might be your personality, that might be the absolute right way. But if it's a difficult or challenging question, give yourself the space and time to think about it, and allow your audience to think about it as well, and think about how they feel about that question. So the fourth place where silence can be used really, really effectively is when somebody has said something that you feel a little bit triggered by. There are people that we work with, there are people in our lives who give us feedback. And sometimes that's solicited and sometimes it's unsolicited. And they deliver it in ways that just feel a bit challenging. It can feel like a slight, it can feel a little rude, or it can just feel like really feedback we just don't want to be getting today. So it can feel like it really triggers us, whether that's the person or the relationship or the content. It doesn't really matter why we feel triggered. But in that moment, our instinct is to defend ourselves, defend the idea, defend the situation, defend our actions, whatever it might be. And so we want to jump straight in and tell them why they're wrong, or tell them what actually happened, or tell them our perspective, whatever it might be. But again, in that moment of reacting rather than responding, the chances are we might use a tone of voice that is not conducive to the situation and might actually escalate any potential for drama or conflict. We might say words that we don't mean. There's a big danger of us actually escalating the situation rather than de-escalating it. So in that moment, it's usually a really, really good idea to employ silence, to keep looking at the person, to keep breathing, and then respond in the best way possible. Now, it might actually be the best thing possible to remove yourself from that situation. So in that moment of silence, you might be thinking, that was really hurtful. That was unnecessary and hurtful. And, you really want to respond in a not nice way. But by thinking that, you can then respond with, actually, that was a really hurtful comment, and I'm going to need a bit of space before we continue this conversation. And then you can just exit that conversation. So you've planted this idea that this is not okay, and you're not happy, and you will come back to it, but not right now. And then you can go off and you can let off steam, you can rant, and then you can formulate your idea. But it means that you haven't escalated the situation in that moment. You've walked away because you employed silence in that moment. Really important in that moment that we don't crumple in on ourselves, and we keep contact with the other person. So keeping looking at them and keeping breathing whilst you're formulating your response is really, really important. But not diving in, not defending ourselves is really, really important there. So the best way of doing that is by breathing. So it's that breathing in and counting to ourselves. Now, in this situation, we might need to count to 5, we might need to count to 10, but actually breathing is critical, because when we feel like we've been attacked or triggered in any way, we tend to stop breathing. Our instinct is to go, and we just hold our breath. So keeping on breathing, keeping eye contact with the other person will allow you to use that silence and will allow you to formulate your next best course of action. And that could be a question, it could be a statement, it could be a rescheduling of a conversation with that other individual. But in those moments, silence can create a very clear indication to the other person that you are not going to stand to be insulted if that's what has happened. Now, the next place that silence can be employed really, really effectively is in difficult conversations. So say perhaps you've had to initiate a difficult conversation, a stretchy conversation with somebody else, where perhaps you're having to give them feedback that you sense they may not react to particularly well, or tell them they haven't done a job as well as they could have done, or a multitude of difficult things, difficult conversations that happen at work. Silence is one of the ways that we can help the other person see that we're holding space for them. When people are upset, when they're angry, when they're tearful, what we as the listener need to do is hold that space, because it tells the other person it's okay. Whatever emotions that you're feeling at the moment are okay, and you're okay, and I'm okay with them. I can hold this space. Now, I'm not saying that you should put up with aggression or violence or any of those things at all, but within the sort of normal bounds of human emotion that's acceptable in a workplace, just by holding silence, by maintaining eye contact, by keeping on breathing, by nodding as the other person is feeling the emotions that we're feeling, they will feel held by your silence. They will feel it's okay for them to feel in the way that they're feeling. Now, many of us want to dive in because we don't like seeing other people in pain. We don't like seeing their discomfort, and we want to fix it. And so we want to dive in and we want to say all these things to make them feel better, to make the pain go away, to make the anger dissipate because we feel uncomfortable with the anger, whatever it might be. But we want to dive in and fix. But actually, in that moment, the other person then doesn't feel seen and heard. And we want to be making sure that we are seeing and hearing the other person's discomfort. So one of the things that we can do around this, if that's something that makes you feel a little bit discomforted, that holding of silence with other people's emotion in the room, is journaling around this idea of the idea that you can cope. You can cope with that other person's emotion, and think about all the times where you've coped with other people's emotions. But you can also cope with what the outcome is for the conversation, so that you can cope and the other person can cope, that they are capable of dealing with this. And the more that we can think about the fact that we're capable and they are capable, it makes those difficult conversations, those uncomfortable conversations, easier to hold, and that silence easier to hold, and we feel less like we need to jump in, and we can ask better questions. So holding the space with silence in difficult conversations, we can do that if we journal around these ideas of how we can cope and how they will cope during and after that stretchy conversation. Now, the final place where silence can be used really, really effectively is on conversations around money. Now, this can feel so stretchy for so many of us. So if we're in a corporate environment, we might need to ask for a bigger budget. We might need to ask for more resources, and that could be people or things. But essentially, we're saying to somebody, can I have more? If you're an entrepreneur, you will be selling something to somebody. You're going to have to state your prices at some point. You're asking them to trust you with that money, for your product or your service, whatever it might be. So money conversations can feel super stretchy. If we don't have that sense of enoughness, we don't trust ourselves, asking for money can feel really difficult. And holding silence in conversations around money can feel incredibly, incredibly stretchy. When we're having those conversations around money, there's something really important that needs to happen. There needs to be value, and the cost need to kind of be connected in our listeners' minds. So we have two ways of doing that. Really very simple. We talk about the value of this situation, the value of this project, the value of getting more resources. We talk about the value first of all, and then we say the cost. Now, or we do it the other way around. We talk about how much something is going to cost, and then we talk about the value that will be created through that spend. Now, whichever way around you decide to do it, whether you do value and then cost, or cost and then value, there is a need for silence after that, because whomever you're talking to needs to assimilate that information. They need to be able to process that information and make it make sense with what they already know about the scenario, the situation, the service, you, their financial situation, whatever it might be. They need time to just kind of work out how that fits. Now, in that silence, they might be thinking, if you're an entrepreneur, that person might be thinking, oh my God, what a deal. That's amazing. And your boss might be thinking, if you work in a corporate space, great, I'm so glad they thought these things through, and we really do need those things. I just need to talk to so-and-so about this bit of budget, and if we take that from, they might be just readjusting to your information. And when we're sitting on the other side of that, if we're not feeling like we're enough and we don't trust ourselves, it's so easy to slip into a narrative of, they don't like my idea, they don't like me, they don't think it's worth it, and we spiral down into these not very helpful thoughts and conversations. So working on your mindset beforehand, particularly around the value. What's the value that this project is offering here? What's the value that I am offering, my service or my product? And being really, really super clear, and knowing that the cost, that money is equated to the value, is so important, because if we don't have that, we cannot hold the silence after we have stated the cost or we stated the value, because we're going to want to over justify. And there's this, and there's this, and if I do that, and maybe we can reduce the cost. And if we did, and we start undermining our ideas by not holding that silence. So I'm hoping that through this conversation, you have seen how powerful silence can be and how stretchy it can feel. If we are not enjoying being seen, then it's going to be very difficult to hold those silences, to hold that space and allow ourselves to be seen by our audience. But if we ever want to negotiate, if we ever want a pay rise, if we are in interviews, if we are holding or being part of difficult conversations, if we're presenting, if we are asking for investment in our company, all of those spaces, and there is a myriad more, all of those spaces require you to be silent at some point, so that the other person can absorb, can assimilate, can feel held, can feel listened to. And if we can't hold the silences, the quality of that communication becomes reduced. And that means our impact is reduced, our credibility is reduced. So working on the mindset part of this, the mindset part of holding silence, is working on your enoughness. I'm enough to be talking to these people. I can hold this space for this person. I'm enough in this moment. I'm enough to be charging this much money. I'm enough to be asking for this pay rise. I'm enough to hold this silence and allow people to absorb my ideas and grow my ideas. So unless we start to feel enough, it can be very, very difficult. And we need to know that we can trust ourselves as well. So if it all goes horribly wrong, we can trust ourselves. We can pick ourselves up. We can learn from this. We can do it again. And if it all goes really, really well, we can trust ourselves with that success, that we're not going to become a big head. Now, if you've listened to the rest of this video, I know that is not the outcome that is ever going to happen to you. It just isn't. You will become more confident, but you're never going to become that annoying person in the room that only ever talks about themselves. Now, from a practical perspective, we need to practice being seen and being heard. So start trying to hold those mini silences, little tiny silences, even if it's just for literally a half a second. Not even that, just a moment, a heartbeat. Practice using those silences in really, really low risk scenarios. When you're out in a restaurant, or you're being served, or you're buying a coffee, or you're waiting in a queue somewhere, just take a moment of allowing that other person to see you and be seen in that moment. And then when you've done that, if you've done that in a low risk scenario, you're doing it at work, reflect on it. What was the impact? Actually, how did I feel when I held that silence? Did I feel like I was more in control? Did I feel like I was holding the space? Could I do it for longer next time? Did I notice how people reacted differently to me when I held that space? And when we're doing those things, when you're reflecting, I really want you to be thinking about what was the impact that I had. Don't worry about being perfect. Perfection is not a thing that we're aiming for here. What was the impact of that silence? Did it make a difference to how people absorbed the information or felt after having an interaction or conversation with me. So as you can see, silence is massively powerful in becoming a very influential communicator and speaker. Now, if you'd like to talk about more about how you can hold silence when you're speaking at work, then I would love to have a coffee chat with you. This is a topic I can get very excited about. And the link to have a coffee chat with me is in the description below. Take care, and we will speak very soon. Bye for now.